What if a force of nature, a human tempest, could erase the world's most powerful empires from existence and then just as suddenly vanish, without a trace, leaving behind only ruins and a deafening silence? This isn't the opening of a fantasy epic, but a very real and chilling chapter of our own history. Tonight, we delve into one of archaeology's most profound enigmas, a story of a mysterious confederation of warriors who brought the Bronze Age crashing down. They are the ghosts of history, the destructive force known only as the Sea Peoples. Who were the Mycenaean, and where did they go? Before we descend into the shadows, let us first walk in the light. Close your eyes for a moment and allow your mind to drift back in time. We are not in our world of instant communication and sprawling cities, but in another equally connected, equally vibrant world. The year is around 1250 BCE. This is the Late Bronze Age, a period that historians now look back on as a kind of first globalization. It was a world knit together by shimmering sea lanes and dusty caravan trails, a world dominated by giants. Imagine a grand stage, illuminated by the Mediterranean sun, upon which the great powers of the age moved in a complex and delicate dance of diplomacy, trade, and occasional warfare. This wasn't a world of isolated kingdoms, but a sophisticated international system, an exclusive club of great kings who addressed each other as brother in their letters written on clay tablets and the elegant cuneiform script of Akkadian, the shared language of power. The lifeblood of this world was trade. From the shores of Greece to the fertile banks of the Nile, from the highlands of Anatolia to the plains of Mesopotamia, goods and ideas flowed in a constant, vital stream. Great ships, their single square sails billowing in the wind, plied the turquoise waters of the Aegean and the eastern Mediterranean. They carried precious cargo that spoke of the wealth and interdependence of these realms. Think of the incredible discovery of the Uluburun shipwreck, found off the coast of modern-day Turkey. A single vessel frozen in time on the seabed for over 3,000 years, that was a microcosm of this entire world. On board was a king's ransom, 10 tons of copper from Cyprus, the main ingredient for bronze. A ton of pure tin, possibly from as far away as Afghanistan. Logs of blackwood from Africa. Canaanite jars filled with resin from the terebinth tree used for incense. Raw glass ingots of cobalt blue and turquoise, a technological marvel of the age. Ivory from elephants and hippos, and a treasure trove of finished goods. Golden chalices, Mycenaean pottery, Egyptian scarabs, and even a bronze sword from Italy. This single ship was a floating testament to a thriving global economy. A network so intricate that the collapse of one part could send tremors through the entire system. This was a world of profound wealth and staggering inequality. In the palaces of the kings, life was opulent. Courtiers dressed in fine linen feasted on exotic foods and admired art of breathtaking beauty. Scribes, a highly respected class, meticulously recorded everything from grain harvests to royal decrees and epic poems. These empires were vast bureaucratic machines, capable of marshaling immense resources for monumental building projects, elaborate religious ceremonies, and of course for war. But the stability of this world was predicated on a delicate balance. The great kings made treaties, cementing their alliances with the exchange of royal daughters in marriage and lavish gifts that were more than mere pleasantries. They were carefully calibrated instruments of foreign policy. The famous peace treaty between the Egyptian Pharaoh Ramesses II and the Hittite king Hattusili III, the earliest surviving parity treaty in history, promised eternal peace and brotherhood, a vow to protect each other against internal and external enemies. It seemed as if this order, this world of bronze and gold, was destined to last forever, governed by powerful men who believed themselves to be the earthly shepherds of the gods. They built their cities of stone and mud brick, confident that the walls would stand for eternity. They inscribed their deeds on monuments, certain that their names would be remembered for all time. But there is a haunting fragility to even the most formidable creations. This magnificent interconnected world humming with life and commerce was more brittle than any of its inhabitants could have possibly imagined. It stood at its absolute zenith, a glorious civilization, basking in the high summer of its existence, utterly oblivious to the fact that its winter was coming. What could possibly shake such a world to its very foundations? To understand the fall, we must first appreciate the titans who were about to be laid low. Let us begin in the rugged heartland of Anatolia, the home of the first great power on our list, the Hittites. Let us journey now north from the sun-drenched coasts of the Levant and climb into the high rugged plateau of Anatolia, what is now modern-day Turkey. Here, amidst windswept mountains and rocky valleys, dwelled a people of formidable strength and stern character. They were the Hittites, the undisputed masters of this land, a continental empire whose power was rooted in the very earth they controlled. Unlike the seafaring traders we will soon meet, the Hittites were a landlocked superpower, their gaze fixed inward on the vast territories they had conquered and the overland caravan routes that brought them their wealth. Theirs was a world of stone iron and military might. At the heart of this empire was their capital Hattusa, a city that was less a metropolis and more a fortress, a breathtaking statement of power and paranoia. Imagine Hattusa not as a ruin, but in its heyday. Its massive double walls, built of enormous cyclopean stones, snaked for miles across the craggy landscape, seamlessly integrating the natural cliffs and rock outcroppings into its defense. To approach it was to be humbled. Great gates pierced the walls, each guarded by magnificent and terrifying stone sculptures. The Lion Gate, with 2 roaring lions carved in high relief, ready to pounce on any who dared enter uninvited. The Sphinx Gate, topped by mysterious hybrid creatures, their faces staring out with an unnerving calm. And beneath the city, a secret network of corbelled stone tunnels or posterns allowed defenders to sally out and surprise a besieging army. Hattusa was designed to be impregnable, a mountain stronghold that declared to the world that the Hittites were here to stay. But their true power, their game-changing contribution to the art of war, thundered across the plains on 2 wheels. The Hittites perfected the war chariot, while other powers like Egypt used lighter 2-man chariots, a driver and an archer. The Hittites engineered a heavier, more robust vehicle. It carried 3 men, a driver, a spearman or archer, and crucially, a 3rd soldier whose sole job was to hold a large shield protecting the other 2. This seemingly small innovation changed everything. The Hittite chariot was a mobile fighting platform, an ancient armored personnel carrier. It was more stable, better protected, and could deliver a devastating shock charge. Imagine hundreds of these war machines advancing in unison, the ground trembling beneath their wheels, the sun glinting off their bronze spearheads. It was a terrifying spectacle, a superweapon that allowed the Hittites to dominate the battlefields of the Near East for centuries. Their military prowess was so great that they could challenge the only other superpower of the age, Egypt. The legendary Battle of Kadesh, fought around 1274 BCE in what is now Syria, was the climactic showdown between these 2 giants. Pharaoh Ramesses II with his thousands of Egyptian troops clashed with the Hittite king Mu'tali II. It was the largest chariot battle ever fought, a brutal, swirling melee involving perhaps 5,000 or 6,000 chariots. While both sides claimed victory in their own propaganda, the result was a strategic stalemate. The Hittites had fought the mighty Egyptian Empire to a draw, proving they were a force of equal stature. This rivalry eventually cooled into a grudging respect, culminating in the famous peace treaty that promised eternal brotherhood, a pact between the 2 most powerful men in the known world. The Hittites were not simply barbarians. They were sophisticated administrators, lawmakers, and diplomats. In the ruins of Hattusa, archaeologists have unearthed a vast royal library of over 25,000 clay tablets. Written in cuneiform, they detail the empire's laws, its religious rituals, dedicated to 1,000 gods, and its intricate diplomatic correspondence with other kingdoms. They were a people of the record, a civilization that understood the power of the written word as much as the power of the sword. They sat at the center of a vast network controlling the vital supplies of metal that fueled the Bronze Age. And yet this empire, so mighty, so well defended, so deeply rooted in its mountain home, was about to be utterly annihilated. The great walls of Hattusa would be breached and burned. The city would be abandoned forever. The clay tablets would fall silent. The entire Hittite civilization would vanish from history so completely that for thousands of years they were known only as a minor tribe mentioned in the Bible. It was not until their capital was rediscovered in the 20th century that the true scale of their power was understood. What could possibly have done this? What force could shatter a fortress like Hattusa and erase an empire from memory? Before we search for an answer, let us turn our gaze southward across the sea to a land of legends, heroes, and palaces of gold. Let us sail to the shores of Mycenaean Greece. Now, let our journey take us across the shimmering Aegean Sea, a body of water the ancients called the wine-dark sea. We leave the stern, landlocked world of the Hittites and sail towards a rugged, mountainous peninsula, a land of silver-green olive groves and sun-bleached rock. This is the Greek mainland, but it is not the Greece of Plato or Aristotle. This is an older, harsher, and far more epic world. This is the realm of the Mycenaeans, the civilization that gave birth to the heroes of Greek mythology. When you hear the names Agamemnon, Achilles, Odysseus, Helen of Troy, you are hearing echoes from this very time, this very culture. For centuries, these were thought to be mere legends, fantastical tales spun by poets. But in the 19th century, archaeologists like Heinrich Schliemann followed the clues in Homer's epics and unearthed the truth. The legends were rooted in a powerful and wealthy Bronze Age reality. The Mycenaeans were a collection of warrior kingdoms, each centered on a spectacular palace fortress perched high on a defensible hill overlooking fertile plains. These were not open, inviting cities. Like Hattusa, they were built for war, for survival. The most famous of them, Mycenae, the legendary home of King Agamemnon, commander of the Greek forces at Troy, is a prime example. To approach it, you must ascend a steep ramp towards its entrance, the magnificent Lion Gate. Two powerful lionesses carved from stone stand guard above the lintel, a symbol of royal power and a stark warning to all who approach. The walls themselves are a marvel. They are built from colossal, irregular blocks of stone, some weighing several tons, fitted together without mortar. Later Greeks, seeing these structures, could not believe that ordinary mortals had built them. They concluded that only the mythical one-eyed giants, the Cyclopes, could have performed such a feat, and so they named these walls Cyclopean. Inside these fortresses, life revolved around the central great hall, the mega-drought. Imagine a vast room, its roof supported by 4 massive pillars surrounding a large circular hearth in the center. Here, the Wanex or king would sit on his throne, holding court, receiving emissaries, and feasting with his warrior elite, his hetairoi. Smoke from the hearth would curl up towards an opening in the ceiling, carrying the smells of roasting meat and wine, while a bard, a singer of tales, would pluck a lyre and chant the epic deeds of gods and heroes. This was a world that valued strength, honor, and martial glory above all else. And we know they were not just legends, because their graves have given up their secrets. Schliemann, excavating at Mycenae, discovered deep shaft graves containing the remains of their earliest kings. Their faces were covered with breathtaking masks of beaten ghee, the most famous of which he mistakenly dubbed the Mask of Agamemnon. They were buried with their weapons, a bronze swords, daggers exquisitely inlaid with scenes of hunting and battle, and massive suits of bronze armor, like the incredible Dendra panoply, a full-body suit of interlocking bronze plates that looks like something a sci-fi robot would wear. Where the Hittites were masters of the land, the Mycenaeans were masters of the sea. Their wealth came from their ships. They were the great maritime traders of the age, their distinctively decorated pottery found from Sicily to Syria. They were the middlemen, the connectors, the entrepreneurs. But they were also, without a doubt, pirates. Raiding was a perfectly honorable and lucrative part of their economy. A successful raid brought back gold bronze cattle and slaves, enhancing a king's power and prestige. Theirs was a volatile existence, a life of high risk and high reward played out upon the waves of the Mediterranean. They maintained their records on clay tablets in a script we now call Linear B, an early form of Greek. But unlike the Hittites, their writing was purely for administration lists of goods, personnel, livestock. The stories, the soul of their culture, were carried in memory and song, a fragile medium that would not survive the coming catastrophe. So here we have our second giant, a proud, fierce, and wealthy warrior culture, immortalized in the greatest epics ever told. A people who built fortresses so strong that future generations thought they were the work of monsters. A people who commanded the sea lanes and were adorned in gold. And yet one by one their citadels would fall, Pylos Mycenae. Tyrants all would be consumed by fire. The palaces would be looted and abandoned. The knowledge of writing would be completely lost. The intricate trade network would shatter. Greece would be plunged into a centuries-long dark age, a period of poverty, isolation, and illiteracy. The heroes who had sailed to conquer the great city of Troy were themselves about to be utterly vanquished. What terror could possibly overwhelm the legendary kings of Mycenae? To find our final great power, the one that seemed truly eternal, we must sail south to the oldest, most stable, and most glorious kingdom of them all. We journey now to the land of the Pharaohs. From the warlike highlands of Greece, our journey takes us south across the great expanse of the Mediterranean to the shores of North Africa and a land nourished by a single sacred river. We have arrived in Egypt. If the Hittites were the stern masters of the land and the Mycenaeans the adventurous masters of the sea, then Egypt was something else entirely. It was the master of time itself. By 1250 BCE, when the Mycenaean kingdoms were at their peak, the Egyptian civilization was already ancient, its history stretching back for almost 2,000 years. The Great Pyramids of Giza, which still fill us with awe today, were already 100 to 300 years old, ancient wonders to the Egyptians of this era, just as they are to us. This was a civilization that radiated an aura of permanence, of divine order, and immortal glory. At the heart of the Egyptian worldview was the concept of Ma'at. It was a profound idea representing truth, balance, harmony, and cosmic order. The entire universe was believed to operate on this principle, from the rising of the sun each day to the predictable annual flooding of the Nile, which brought life-giving silt to the fields. The sacred duty of the pharaoh was to uphold Ma'at on earth. He was not merely a king. He was a living god, a Horus in life, and an Osiris in death, the sole intermediary between humanity and the vast pantheon of gods. This divine mandate gave Egyptian society a unique stability. While other empires were built on the charisma of a single warlord or a fragile network of alliances, Egypt was built on a cosmic principle that had endured for millennia. In the era of the New Kingdom, this stability translated into unimaginable power and wealth. The capital city of Thebes, which the Greeks would later call the City of 100 Gates, was the epicenter of this world. It was a sprawling metropolis of palaces, villas, and above all temples, of a scale that beggar belief. Imagine walking the avenue of ram-headed sphinxes leading to the great temple of Amun-Ra at Karnak. You pass through colossal gateways or pylons into a forest of stone. The great hypostyle hall alone contained 134 massive columns, each one 69 feet tall. Their surfaces covered in a vibrant tapestry of painted hieroglyphs and reliefs depicting the pharaoh communing with the gods. This wasn't just architecture. It was theology carved in stone, a declaration that this was the center of the universe, the place where the Daying touched the earth. This grandeur was fueled by two things, grain and gold. The predictable rhythm of the Nile's flood made Egypt the breadbasket of the ancient world, capable of producing vast agricultural surpluses that could support a massive population and a standing professional army. And from the mines of Nubia to the south came a seemingly endless river of gold. In the diplomatic letters of the age, foreign kings would beg the pharaoh for gold, writing that in Egypt, gold is as common as dust. Protected by the vast deserts to its east and west, the sea to its north, and the cataracts of the Nile to its south. Egypt was a geopolitical fortress, a self-sufficient paradise that could engage with the world on its own terms. They were not isolationists. The pharaohs of the New Kingdom were ambitious conquerors. Great warrior kings like Thutmose III and Ramesses II had marched their armies deep into the Levant, creating an Egyptian empire that stretched to the borders of the Hittite realm. They commanded powerful fleets and maintained a sophisticated diplomatic corps. They had faced the Hittite war machine at Kadesh and emerged unbowed. They were the world's preeminent superpower, a civilization at the zenith of its confidence and creative energy. Their culture, their religion, and their identity were so strong, so ancient, so deeply rooted in the sacred black earth of their homeland that it seemed nothing could possibly shake them. They were the eternal kingdom, the bedrock of civilization, the unmoving center of a world in flux. And so the stage is set. We have our three titans, the Hittites secure in their mountain fortress, the Mycenaeans, the golden lords of the sea, and Egypt, the immortal kingdom of the gods. A world of incredible wealth, complexity, and power, all interconnected, all seemingly destined to endure. But a shadow was beginning to fall upon this brilliant world. Strange whispers were on the wind, stories of drought and famine. The delicate balance that held this world together was beginning to fray at the edges, and out on the horizon, beyond the sight of the kings in their palaces, a storm was gathering. A storm not of wind or rain, but of people. No great collapse happens in an instant. Before the fire there is the drought. Before the scream there is the whisper. The magnificent world of the late Bronze Age, which seemed so eternal, so divinely ordained, was beginning to show signs of a deep and terrifying sickness. The foundations of their golden world were not being shaken by armies or invaders, not yet. They were being eroded by something far more insidious, something they could not fight with chariots or build walls against, the climate itself. Evidence gathered from ancient pollen lakebed sediments and tree rings tells a chilling story. Around 1250 BCE, the eastern Mediterranean entered a prolonged period of climate change, a mega-drought that may have lasted for decades, perhaps even a century or more. The reliable winter rains began to fail. The summers grew hotter, longer, and more merciless. Imagine the consequences. In a world utterly dependent on agriculture, a world without modern irrigation or fertilizers, a lack of rain meant crop failure. Crop failure meant famine, and famine was the great dissolver of civilizations. The entire economic model of these palace states was based on surplus. The king and his bureaucracy would collect grain and olive oil from the farmers as taxes, store it in vast palace storerooms, and then redistribute it to the soldiers, the artisans, the priests, and the scribes who made the empire function. But what happens when there is no surplus to collect? The system starves from the bottom up. The farmers with nothing to give and their own families starving would abandon their lands or rise up in revolt. The palace, unable to pay its soldiers and workers, would lose its authority. The complex machinery of the state would grind to a halt. We don't have to imagine this. We can hear the desperation in the voices of the past. From the archives at Hattusa, we have found clay tablets, letters from the great Hittite kings, no longer boasting of their military victories, but begging for help. They wrote to the pharaohs of Egypt and to the wealthy merchants of port cities like Ugarit in Syria pleading for emergency shipments of grain to save their people from starvation. One Hittite queen wrote that there was a burning in her lands. Think of the humiliation. The ruler of a mighty empire whose chariots had faced down the armies of Ramesses II was now reduced to begging his neighbors for bread. This reveals a world in crisis where even the most powerful were being brought to their knees by hunger. This widespread famine had a devastating domino effect on the interconnected world they had built. The intricate web of trade began to unravel. Ships that once carried tin and ivory now carried desperate pleas for food if they sailed at all. Overland trade routes became perilous, stalked by bandits, and plagued by unrest. The brotherhood of kings, so carefully maintained through gifts and diplomacy, fractured under the strain. When your own kingdom is starving, you have little to offer your allies. Trust eroded, replaced by suspicion and fiji fear. Each kingdom became an island, looking inward, desperately trying to preserve what little it had. The great international system, the world's first experiment in globalization, was collapsing under its own weight, starved of the resources, and the trust that had held it together. This was a world on the brink. A world weakened by hunger, destabilized by internal rebellions, and disconnected from its former partners. The magnificent palaces of Mycenaean and Hattusa. For all their outward strength, were becoming hollow shells, their authority waning, their storehouses empty. The civilization was like a great ancient tree, its leaves still green, but its roots secretly rotting away in the dry, parched earth. It was a world rife with desperation, a world full of displaced, starving people with nothing left to lose. And a person with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous force of all. The stage was set. The world was not healthy and robust when the final blow came. It was feverish, weakened, and profoundly vulnerable. It was a tinderbox waiting for a spark. And that spark was about to arrive not from the dry inland plains, but from the shimmering, unforgiving horizon of the sea. And then the spark landed. The slow, creeping sickness that had weakened the Bronze Age world erupted into a sudden and violent conflagration. The end did not come gradually. It came as a firestorm, a wave of destruction so swift, so total, and so widespread that it remains difficult to comprehend even today. Within the span of a single generation, from roughly 1200 to 1175 BCE, the world of the great kings was wiped from the face of the earth. This was not a slow decline. It was an apocalypse. When archaeologists excavate the great cities of this era, they encounter a chilling and unmistakable signature. In the layers of the earth which read like pages in a history book, there is a stark black line. It is a destruction layer, a thick seam of ash, charcoal, and burned mud brick that screams of a final terrible event. This dark scar is found everywhere. At Mycenae, the Cyclopean walls were toppled, and the palace of Agamemnon was consumed by a fire so intense it vitrified the clay tablets in the archives, baking them into permanence. At Tiryns, the massive fortifications were unable to prevent a similar inferno. In the palace of Pylos, home of the wise old King Nestor, from the Odyssey, archaeologists found hundreds of clay storage jars smashed on the floor, and the skeletons of people trapped where they fell buried under the rubble of their burning home. There was no one left to give them a proper burial. Across the sea in Anatolia, the same horror unfolded, the great Hittite capital of Hattusa. The impregnable mountain fortress that had stood for centuries was violently destroyed and abandoned, never to be a center of power again. Its mighty empire, which had rivaled Egypt, simply evaporated, its people scattered, its language forgotten. Along the prosperous coast of the Levant, the story repeats with haunting monotony. Great trading cities like Alalach and Carchemish were razed to the ground. The destruction was not simply conquest, where one ruler replaces another. This was obliteration. The goal seemed to be to erase these cities from existence. Imagine the terror. A thriving, sophisticated city bustling with trade and life one day is a smoking, silent ruin the next. This was not the work of a conventional army marching to conquer territory. The attackers did not stay to rule. They came, they burned, they killed, and they moved on like a human hurricane sweeping along the coastlines. They left behind no inscriptions, no monuments, no new kingdoms in their immediate wake. They left only ash and silence. The sheer scale is staggering. From the Greek mainland to the shores of Syria, from the Anatolian plateau to the island of Cyprus, a nexus of the copper trade civilization after civilization collapsed into fire and ruin. Writing systems vanished. Complex economies shattered. International trade ceased. Population centers were wiped out or abandoned, and the survivors were left scrabbling for existence in a world that had suddenly become poor, ignorant, and violent. For centuries, the identity of these destroyers was a complete mystery. They were phantoms, a nameless, faceless force of nature. Who could have coordinated such a widespread campaign of annihilation? What new weapon, what new tactic, what new level of fury did they possess that allowed them to overwhelm the most powerful empires on Earth? The rubble itself offered few clues, but in the ruins of one of the greatest port cities of the age, a final desperate cry for help was found. A message written in the city's final moments. It was a single clay tablet, a voice from the heart of the apocalypse, and it gives us our first terrifying glimpse of the enemy. Let us zoom in from the wide continental view of the destruction to a single place, a single moment of terror. We traveled to the coast of Syria, to the site of the ancient city of Ugarit. In its prime, Ugarit was one of the most vibrant and cosmopolitan cities in the world. It was a bustling port, a crucial hub where the trade routes of the Mediterranean met the overland caravans from Mesopotamia. Its markets would have been a kaleidoscope of cultures, a babel of languages, Mycenaean, Cypriot, Egyptian, Hittite, Babylonian. The city's palace housed a magnificent library and a vast archive of diplomatic, economic, and literary texts written on thousands of clay tablets. Ugarit was a jewel of the Bronze Age, a city that perfectly embodied the wealth and interconnectedness of the era, and it was about to be erased from history. In the ruins of the city, archaeologists made a discovery that still sends a shiver down the spine. In a small chamber, they found a kiln, a type of oven used for baking clay tablets to make them hard and permanent. And inside that kiln was a small batch of letters, the last correspondence of the kingdom, seemingly placed there in a desperate final attempt at preservation as the city came under attack. The very fire that destroyed Ugarit is what preserved its last words for us to read. It is among these final panicked dispatches that we find our first eyewitness account of the catastrophe. One letter written by Ugarit's last king, a man named Amurapi, is a desperate plea to the king of Alatia, which was ancient Cyprus. The terror and panic are baked into every line. Amurapi writes, and you can almost hear the tremor in his voice as he dictates to the scribe, "My father, behold, the enemy's ships came. My cities were burned, and they did evil things in my country." Here it is, the first concrete clue. The phantoms who brought the world down were not a land army. They were a naval force. They came from the sea. But the letter reveals an even more tragic layer to the story. Amurapi continues explaining his terrifying predicament. "Does not my father know that all my troops and chariots are in the Hittite country, and all my ships are in the land of Luka? The country is abandoned to itself." This is the heart of the tragedy. At the very moment of his kingdom's greatest peril, King Amurapi was defenseless. His army had been sent inland to help his overlord, the Hittite king, who was facing his own existential threats. And his navy, his first line of defense against a seaborne enemy, was away on patrol far to the north along the Anatolian coast, likely hunting for these very raiders, but in the wrong place. The enemy had struck with terrifying strategic precision, hitting a vital and wealthy target when its defenses were completely down. That final line, "The country is abandoned to itself," is one of the most haunting sentences to survive from the ancient world. It is the formal declaration of a kingdom's death. It is the moment a king realizes that the entire system has failed. There is no one coming to help. The Hittite Empire is too weak to protect its vassals. His own forces are out of position. The alliances that defined their world for centuries have proven worthless. There is nothing left but to face the end alone. Imagine the scene: King Amurapi in his palace, receiving reports of enemy sails on the horizon, knowing his beaches are undefended, dictating this last desperate message in the faint hope it will reach an ally. But help would never arrive. The letter was never sent. Shortly after it was written, Ugarit was sacked and burned so completely that its location was lost to history for over 3,000 years. The cry for help from Ugarit was met with silence. The tablet baked hard in the city's final inferno gives us our first profile of the killer, a seaborne enemy swift, ruthless, and strategically brilliant. But it does not give us a name. The trail goes cold in the ashes of the Levant. To find a name to see the face of this enemy, we must travel south to the last great empire left standing, the one kingdom that managed to confront this tide of destruction head-on and live to tell the tale. We must go to Egypt. The trail of evidence which ran cold in the ashes of Ugarit reappears in the most spectacular fashion in the land of the last standing giant. While the Hittite Empire had vanished and the Mycenaean palaces were smoldering ruins, Egypt endured. A few decades after the main wave of destruction swept the north, the storm finally reached the shores of the Nile. But here it met a pharaoh determined to hold the line. His name was Ramesses III, one of the last great warrior kings of the new kingdom, and he would not let his kingdom fall without a fight. More importantly for us, he would make sure that his struggle, his victory, and the identity of his enemy were recorded for all eternity. To see this record, we must travel to his magnificent mortuary temple at Medinet Habu on the west bank of the Nile at Thebes. This is more than a temple. It is a colossal stone monument to his reign, a piece of state propaganda carved in limestone and granite. Its towering gateways and vast walls are covered from top to bottom with thousands of square feet of intricate reliefs and hieroglyphic inscriptions celebrating his triumphs. And among the most prominent of these inscriptions is the official Egyptian account of their war against the mysterious invaders who had shattered the world. Here on these walls, the enemy is finally given a name. Unlike the desperate private plea from Ugarit, this is a triumphant public proclamation. Ramesses III leaves no doubt about the scale of the crisis. The inscriptions declare, "The foreign countries made a conspiracy in their islands. All at once, the lands were removed and scattered in the fray. No land could stand before their arms." The text then lists the fallen, a roll call of the dead empires. From Hatti, the Hittites, Kaod, a region in Syria, Carchemish, Arzawa, and Alashia, Cyprus, on being cut off at one time. The Egyptians knew exactly what had happened to their old rivals and allies. They saw themselves as the last bastion of civilization standing against a tidal wave of chaos that had already drowned the known world. The inscriptions describe how the invaders moved not just as a raiding party, but as a migrating people with their families in tow on ox carts. A camp was set up in one place in Amurru, Syria. They desolated its people, and its land was like that which has never come into being. And then comes the crucial passage, the moment the phantoms are given a face. They were coming forward toward Egypt while the flame was prepared before them. Their confederation was the Pelesit, Cheker Shekelesh, Denyen, and Weshesh, lands united. Here it is, the great reveal. The invaders were not a single people, but a confederation, a coalition of different tribes who had banded together for a common purpose. and now they have names. The Peliset, the Checker, the Shekelesh. These are the names that echo down through history. Modern scholars have collectively dubbed this alliance the Sea Peoples, a term taken directly from these Egyptian accounts. And the temple gives us more than just names. It gives us their faces. The stone walls explode with scenes of dramatic, chaotic battle. We see the Egyptian army with its disciplined ranks of archers and charioteers engaging the invaders on land. The Sea Peoples are depicted as fierce warriors wearing distinctive horned helmets or elaborate feathered headdresses. They carry round shields and fight with long leaf-shaped swords, a departure from the sickle swords common in Egypt and the Levant. But the most stunning relief depicts a massive naval battle fought in the estuaries of the Nile Delta. We see the Egyptian ships powered by both sail and oar grappling with the Sea People's vessels, which have high bird-headed prows. The scene is a maelstrom of violence. Archers firing from the masts, soldiers crossing planks to board enemy ships, men pierced with spears tumbling into the water filled with crocodiles. And presiding over it all is the heroic figure of Ramesses III, firing his bow, the divine defender of order against chaos. Egypt was victorious. Ramesses III had saved his kingdom. He had met the fury from the sea and thrown it back. And in doing so, he created the single most important historical document of the entire Bronze Age collapse. The walls of Medinet Habu are our ground zero. They give us a name, the Sea Peoples. They give us an image, the feathered helmets and round shields. They confirm the scale of the destruction across the ancient world. The mystery is no longer about a nameless phantom. The case now has a list of suspects. The greatest historical detective story can truly begin. Who exactly were the Peliset, the Checker, and the others in this deadly confederation? Now that we have names, the investigation can truly begin. The inscriptions of Ramesses III give us our list of suspects, a roll call for the destroyers of a world: the Peliset, the Checker, the Shekelesh, the Denian, the Weshesh. Other texts mention groups like the Shardana, who had troubled Egypt even before the main invasion. But who were these people really? Where did they come from? The first and most crucial thing to understand is that these names are what the Egyptians called them. They are exonyms, labels given by an outsider. We have no records from the Sea Peoples themselves, so we don't know what they called themselves. It's like trying to understand a people by reading only their enemies' intelligence reports. The names could be Egyptian attempts to pronounce foreign words, or they could simply be descriptive nicknames. Untangling their identities is one of the most fascinating puzzles in ancient history. Let's start with the prime suspect, the group whose identity is the most widely accepted, the Peliset. The name itself, when spoken aloud, sounds strikingly similar to another name from ancient history, the Philistines. According to the Egyptian records, after Ramesses III defeated the Peliset and their allies, he settled the captured survivors as vassals along the southern coastal plain of Canaan. That very region would become known in the Hebrew Bible and other texts as Philistia, the land of the Philistines, a powerful enemy of the early Israelites. The connection is more than just a name. When archaeologists began excavating the great Philistine cities, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, they discovered a dramatic cultural shift right around this time. Suddenly, a new style of pottery appears. It's sophisticated, beautifully decorated, and its closest parallels are not found in Canaan, but hundreds of miles away in the Aegean, in the world of the collapsing Mycenaean civilization. This Mycenaean-style pottery, along with other clues like new architectural forms and hearths, is the archaeological smoking gun. It strongly suggests that the Peliset, who became the biblical Philistines, were originally migrants from the Greek world, refugees from the chaos that had engulfed their own homeland. What about the others? The clues are more speculative but equally tantalizing. Take the Denian. Many scholars have drawn a compelling line between the Denian, or Danuna, as they are sometimes called, and the Dana Oiikian, a name that the poet Homer used frequently in the Iliad to describe the ancient Greeks. Could it be that one of the very groups of heroes from the Trojan War sagas, the Achaean Greeks, was also a part of this destructive migration? It's a shocking thought that the victims of the collapse in Greece were also the perpetrators of collapse elsewhere. The geographical net widens with the other tribes. The Shekelesh are often hypothetically linked to the island of Sicily, home to an ancient people known as the Siculi. The Shardana, a group of mercenaries recognizable in Egyptian art by their distinctive horned helmets, are almost universally connected with the island of Sardinia. The similarities in the names are too strong for most scholars to ignore. The problem is the direction of the arrow. Did these people come from Sicily and Sardinia to raid the east? Or were they Eastern Mediterranean peoples who, after being defeated, fled west and eventually settled on those islands, giving them their names? The evidence is ambiguous, a historical chicken and egg problem. What emerges is not a picture of a single unified nation on the march. Instead, we see a motley confederation, a loose alliance of desperate peoples from all corners of a shattered world. The evidence, from pottery to weapons to possible name connections, points to a center of gravity in the Aegean and the central Mediterranean. They were likely a mix of displaced Mycenaean Greeks fleeing their burning palaces, opportunistic raiders from islands like Sicily and Sardinia, and perhaps coastal Anatolians uprooted by the fall of the Hittite Empire. Think of it like a beehive being kicked over. The collapse of the great stabilizing empires was the kick. The sea peoples were the angry homeless swarm that flew out in every direction, stinging everything in its path. They were the dispossessed, the refugees, the famine-stricken, and the pirates. They were the human consequence of a world falling apart. They were not simply the cause of the Bronze Age collapse. They were its most terrifying symptom. The question is no longer just who they were, but what truly set them in motion. Was it a simple migration or something far more complex? The investigation now keys from identifying the suspects, Amr-Mamatids, to understanding their motives. The walls of Medinet Habu give us our suspects, but they don't give us the motive. The ashes of Ugarit give us a sense of the terror, but not the cause. To understand the why behind this cataclysm, we must move from collecting evidence to building theories. We must open the case file on the Bronze Age collapse and examine the prime suspects and the scenarios for their crimes. The first, and by far the most fleshed out theory, centers on that name. We keep returning to the Peliset and their undeniable connection to one of history's most famous peoples. Suspect number 1. The Philistines of the Bible. This is the bedrock theory, the one against which all others are measured. It proposes that the most significant group of sea peoples to leave a lasting legacy were the direct ancestors of the Philistines. The evidence for this is like a three-legged stool, strong and stable, resting on linguistics, geography, and archaeology. The first leg is the name itself. The Egyptian scribes called them the Peliset. The later Hebrew scribes writing the books of the Old Testament called their coastal enemies the Pelishtim. The phonetic similarity is unmistakable and was the first clue that alerted historians that they were talking about the same people. The second leg is geography. The Egyptian records state that after their defeat, Ramesses III settled the Peliset warriors and their families in a series of fortified garrison towns along the southern Levantine coast to act as a buffer and a mercenary force for the Egyptian Empire. This exact coastal strip, encompassing the 5 cities of Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath, is precisely the territory that the Bible identifies as Philistia. The Egyptian account of where they put the Peliset perfectly matches the location of the biblical Philistines. But the third leg of the stool is the most compelling, the physical proof you can hold in your hand. It's the archaeology. When archaeologists dig in the ruins of these Philistine cities, they find that right around 1200 BCE, the local Canaanite culture vanishes and is replaced by something entirely new and foreign. The most obvious marker is the pottery. a new style dubbed Mycenaean 2IC or Philistine Bishrom ware suddenly appears in huge quantities. It is a direct descendant of the pottery made in the Greek and Aegean world, decorated with distinctive patterns, often featuring stylized birds. This is not a gradual influence. It is the sudden arrival of a complete ceramic toolkit, a clear fingerprint of a large migrant group. They also brought their architecture building houses, with central circular hearths, a feature common in Mycenaean Greece, but completely alien to Canaan. Even their diet was different. At Philistine sites, archaeologists find a dramatic spike in the number of pig bones, indicating that pork was a major part of their diet. This stands in stark contrast to their Canaanite and Israelite neighbors, for whom pork was a cultural and religious taboo. They didn't just conquer, they brought their homes, their pots, and their recipes with them. This evidence allows us to reconstruct a powerful narrative. A people from the Aegean world, perhaps Cyprus or mainland Greece, were uprooted by the widespread chaos. They became wanderers, joining a great confederation of other displaced peoples. They traveled by sea, becoming pirates and raiders, and eventually made a bold attempt to conquer the richest prize of all Egypt. After being soundly defeated by Ramesses III, they were disarmed and resettled as Egyptian vassals. Over time, they re-established their independence from a declining Egypt and became the dominant power on the coast, the formidable Philistines of biblical fame. This theory provides a breathtaking historical context for the Bible. It means that when David confronts Goliath, it is more than a battle of two men. It is a clash of worlds. Goliath, the champion from Gath, described with his bronze helmet and heavy armor, may be a distant echo of a Mycenaean warrior tradition, a hero out of Homer, transplanted to the hills of Judea. The Philistines were not just some local tribe. They were the last ghosts of the Bronze Age, the descendants of a cataclysm, a people with a long and traumatic memory of a world lost to fire and water. This theory is powerful because it weaves together Egyptian texts, the Hebrew Bible, and modern archaeology into a single coherent story. It gives a name and a history to a people who shaped the fate of the ancient Near East. But the Peliset, for all their importance, were only one piece of the puzzle. Their story is that of a single group. It doesn't fully explain the sheer scale of the movement. Why were so many different peoples, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, the Checker, all on the move at the same time? To answer that, we need to zoom out to a theory that sees this not as the action of one group, but as a continental chain reaction. While the Philistine theory gives us a compelling identity for one of the key players, it doesn't fully explain the sheer scope of the crisis. Why were so many different groups on the move all at once? This brings us to our second major theory, one that sees the Sea Peoples not as a coordinated army, but as the final catastrophic result of a continental-scale chain reaction. This is the theory of a chaotic migration, a human domino effect. Imagine the ancient world not as a static map of empires, but as a board of precariously balanced dominoes. All it takes is for one to fall to start a chain reaction. This theory proposes that somewhere on the fringes of the Great Bronze Age civilizations, perhaps in the less developed lands of the Balkans, or on the islands of the central Mediterranean like Sicily and Sardinia, the first domino was pushed. The trigger could have been localized famine, internal conflict, or population pressure. A single tribe forced to move invades the territory of its neighbor. This second tribe, now displaced, is forced to push into the lands of a third. With each step, the wave of people grows, gathering mass and momentum. This is not an army with a grand strategy. This is a human tidal wave, a chaotic and desperate torrent of humanity. Starving farmers, opportunistic pirates, unemployed mercenaries, and entire communities with their families and possessions in tow are swept up in the current. The confederation that Ramesses III described may not have been a formal alliance forged in a war council, but a rolling, ever-growing snowball of the desperate and ad hoc coalition of peoples who perhaps couldn't even understand each other's languages, united only by a shared hunger and a forward momentum. This human river, once it started flowing, would have been almost impossible to stop. This theory explains the terrifying efficiency of their destruction. A traditional army invades to conquer, to hold territory, to extract tribute. They have supply lines, a command structure, and a political goal. A migrating horde has none of these things. Their only goal is survival and finding a new place to settle. They must live off the land they are moving through, which means they consume everything, like a swarm of locusts. They don't want to rule the cities they encounter. They want the food, the metal, and the wealth stored inside them. The fact that the Egyptian reliefs show the sea peoples traveling with their families in heavy ox carts is a crucial piece of evidence for this theory. This was not just a military campaign. It was a folk wandering, the movement of entire nations who had burned their bridges behind them. They had nowhere to go but forward. This scenario powerfully explains the evidence on the ground. It accounts for the widespread, almost simultaneous destruction across the eastern Mediterranean. It wasn't one force moving with impossible speed, but a massive, sprawling wave front crashing against the shores of Anatolia, Cyprus, and the Levant all at once. It also explains the eclectic mix of peoples in the Confederation. They were simply the collection of all the different dominoes that had been knocked over along the way. The wave crashed against the great civilizations, shattering the Hittite Empire and the Mycenaean kingdoms, which were already brittle from drought and internal strife. Finally, the wave broke against the Rock of Egypt. Ramesses III's victory was not just a military triumph. It was the act of building a seawall that finally stopped the human tsunami. The aftermath, with groups like the Peliset and Checker settling on the nearby coast, is exactly what you would expect. The floodwaters recede, leaving pools and puddles of stranded migrants who now have no choice but to try and build a new life in the wreckage. This theory recasts the Sea Peoples. They are no longer a mysterious cabal of super warriors, but perhaps the ultimate victims of the age. They were the debris of a collapsing world, refugees who became raiders out of necessity. It's a compelling and humane perspective, but it opens up another darker possibility. If many of these migrants, like the Peliset, came from the civilized lands of the Aegean, it begs the question, were they just victims of a wider collapse, or were they something else? What if the predators were, in fact, the survivors of their own dead civilization turned feral by their loss? The theory of a chaotic migration paints a powerful picture of desperation, but it leads to a more specific and chilling question. If these migrants were indeed refugees, who exactly were they? Theory 3 offers a provocative answer. The Sea Peoples were not barbarians from the fringes of civilization. They were the civilized, or rather the recently decivilized. They were the direct survivors of the great kingdoms that had already fallen victims, who had become predators. Let's focus on the Mycenaean world of Greece. As we've seen, their magnificent palace citadels were violently destroyed. Their society was a highly centralized top-down structure. The Wanax, the king and his palace bureaucracy, managed everything: agriculture, manufacturing, religion, and warfare. A soldier was a soldier, a potter was a potter, a sailor was a sailor. Each person had a specialized role within a complex machine. But what happens when the machine breaks? When the palace is burned, the king is killed, and the administrative records are turned to ash, the entire social order evaporates. The soldier has no one to pay him. The sailor has no ships commissioned by the state. The farmer has no one to protect his crops. Society itself dissolves into chaos. Now consider the skills these people possessed. The Mycenaeans were among the most accomplished mariners and warriors of their age. They had built powerful ships, crafted effective bronze weapons, and practiced sophisticated military tactics when their world collapsed from within. What were these thousands of unemployed soldiers, sailors, and dispossessed warlords supposed to do? They had the skills of predation and the motivation of survival. So they took to their ships. The very vessels that once carried trade goods and royal emissaries were repurposed for piracy. This theory suggests a dark transformation. The first victims of the Bronze Age, collapsed the Greeks, whose own society had imploded, became its primary aggressors. They were no longer Mycenaeans. They were simply raiders. They would have started by preying on their own shores and islands, but as those resources were exhausted, they would have looked further afield. Their fleet's initially small bands of survivors would have grown, attracting other outcasts, pirates and refugees from the collapsing Hittite coastline and elsewhere. This growing flotilla of the dispossessed, armed with the military and naval technology of a fallen superpower, became the Sea Peoples. This narrative fits the evidence perfectly. It explains why the Peliset, who became the Philistines, used Mycenaean-style pottery. It was their ancestral craft. It explains the potential connection between the Danaan and the Danoi. One of Homer's names for the Greeks, they were one and the same. It explains why the Sea Peoples were such a formidable naval force. They weren't learning on the job. They were experts using the very skills that had once made their civilization great. We can see parallels throughout history. Think of the Vikings. A specific set of social and environmental pressures in Scandinavia pushed a society of brilliant shipbuilders and navigators to turn outwards, beginning an age of raiding that terrorized Europe. Or think of the golden age of piracy in the Caribbean, largely fueled by thousands of skilled sailors and ex-privateers left unemployed after the great European wars. When a large population with maritime and military skills loses its organizing principle, it often turns to piracy. The Sea Peoples may have been the great pirates of the Bronze Age, born from the death of their own world. This theory is filled with a terrible, tragic irony. The agents of destruction were a mirror image of the civilizations they were attacking. They were the ghosts of the Bronze Age wielding its own weapons. It suggests a vicious cycle collapse creates raiders, and the raiders sail out and create more collapse. The fire that burned the palace at Pylos in Greece was carried by its survivors to the shores of Ugarit in Syria. The destruction fed on itself. It's a compelling, self-contained explanation. And yet, it still places the blame on human actors on their desperation and greed. What if even this tragic cycle was just a symptom of a much larger failure? What if the problem wasn't a single group of people, but the very system by which the entire world operated? This brings us to the final and most comprehensive theory, the one that many historians now believe gets closest to the truth. It suggests that there was no single cause, no one culprit. The Bronze Age was not murdered by an outside force. It died of systemic failure. This is the theory of a systems collapse. It posits that the Sea Peoples were not the disease that killed the ancient world, but rather the final violent symptom of a body that was already succumbing to a multitude of illnesses. Think of it as a perfect storm. Not one, but several catastrophic events converged at the same time, creating a devastating feedback loop where each crisis amplified the others. The first and perhaps most important factor, as we've seen, was climate change. The prolonged mega-drought created the initial foundational stress. Decades of failed harvests led to widespread famine. Famine in turn led to social and political breakdown. The sacred contract between the kings and their people, where the people provided loyalty and labor in exchange for security and sustenance from the kings via the king, was broken. Starving peasants would have risen up in rebellion against the palace authorities who could no longer feed them. As internal order frayed the intricate web of international trade, the very lifeblood of the Bronze Age began to hemorrhage. The world was highly specialized and dangerously interdependent. To make bronze the essential material of the age, you needed copper, which primarily came from Cyprus, and tin, which was imported from as far away as Afghanistan. When famine and rebellion disrupt the mining of copper, or the long-distance caravan routes for tin, the entire military-industrial complex grinds to a halt. You cannot field an army with bronze swords and shields if you can no longer produce bronze. When Egypt, The breadbasket of the world is suffering its own shortages. It cannot export the grain needed to save the Hittites from starvation. The system's complexity, once its greatest strength, now became its fatal flaw. To make matters worse, some geological studies suggest this period coincided with an earthquake storm, a phase of intense seismic activity along the tectonic plates of the Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean. A series of powerful earthquakes could have toppled palaces, destroyed harbors, and further disrupted trade, adding to the growing sense of chaos and the feeling that the world itself was coming apart, that the Yenis had abandoned humanity. So where do the Sea Peoples fit into this picture of total systemic failure? In this model, they are not the cause. They are the consequence. They are the amalgamation of all the system's failed parts. They were the starving farmers who abandoned their barren fields. They were the palace guards left unpaid and unemployed when the royal treasury was empty. They were the coastal communities in Anatolia whose Hittite overlords could no longer protect them. They were the Mycenaean sailors whose trading ports had been destroyed by earthquakes or civil war. All these desperate, displaced people, products of a dozen different crises, coalesced into a mobile predatory force. The Sea Peoples were an opportunistic infection attacking a body whose immune system had already collapsed. A healthy and prosperous Bronze Age world, with its powerful armies and fleets, might have swatted them away like flies. But against a world already crippled by famine, plague, internal revolts, and economic collapse, their raids were devastating. They didn't initiate the collapse. They accelerated it and made it irreversible. They were the scavengers who arrived to pick the bones of a civilization that was already lying on its deathbed. This theory is sobering because it lacks the simple narrative satisfaction of a hero and a villain. It suggests that great civilizations can die not with a bang, but with a complex and agonizing unraveling. It's a story about fragility, about how even the most sophisticated systems can be vulnerable to a confluence of pressures. The Sea Peoples in this light were not the mysterious murderers of the Bronze Age. They were its children, its heirs, and its undertakers, the agents of a dark reset that would ultimately pave the way for a new world to be born from the ashes. Having explored the grand theories of who the Sea Peoples were and what set them in motion, we turn to a more practical question. How did they do it? How could a seemingly chaotic confederation of migrants and raiders bring down the most powerful and sophisticated military machines of the age? Did they possess some revolutionary weapon or a tactical genius that gave them an insurmountable edge? To answer this, we must once again return to the stone walls of Medinet Habu, our only detailed visual guide to how these mysterious people fought. When we look at the Egyptian carvings, we see warriors equipped with a distinctive kit. One of the most significant items is their sword. The great Bronze Age empires, like Egypt and the Hittites, often favored curved sickle swords or kopashes designed for hooking and close-quarters combat within dense infantry formations. The Sea Peoples, by contrast, are often depicted wielding long, straight, leaf-shaped swords. This type of sword, known to archaeologists as the Medinet was primarily a cutting and slashing weapon. It offered longer reach and was brutally effective in more fluid, individualistic combat rather than the pushing and shoving of shield walls. This may represent a fundamental shift in military philosophy, away from the disciplined formations of state armies and towards a more chaotic, aggressive style of fighting. Their defensive gear also tells a story. Instead of the large, heavy tower shields of the Mycenaeans or the cumbersome shields of the Egyptians, the Sea Peoples almost universally carried smaller, lighter round shields. A round shield is far more maneuverable, excellent for deflecting blows, and for use in dynamic one-on-one fights. Again, this points to a fighting style that prioritized individual warrior skill over collective formation discipline. Their armor was typically a bronze or leather corselet, but their most iconic feature was their headgear. The Shardana are unmistakable with their helmets adorned with long horns, while the Peliset and their allies wore striking feathered headdresses, which might have been made of reeds leather or horsehair set in a kind of mohawk style. This gear wasn't just protective. It was a psychological weapon designed to create a terrifying alien appearance that would unnerve their opponents before the first blow was even struck. On the sea, they were a formidable force, but not an invincible one. The reliefs show their ships were primarily sailing vessels with a distinctive high prow often carved into the shape of a bird's head. They were essentially transports for marine infantry. Their goal was to sail close to an enemy board their ship and win through hand-to-hand combat. This tactic proved fatal when they faced Ramesses III in the Nile Delta. The Egyptians, using ships powered by large banks of oars as well as sails, had a crucial advantage in mobility in the narrow windless river channels. They could outmaneuver the Sea People's ships, keep them at a distance, and rain down volleys of arrows from their archers, decimating the Sea People's warriors before they could even get close enough to fight. The Egyptians turned the battle from a boarding action into a slaughterhouse at range. For decades, a popular theory suggested that the Sea People's secret weapon was iron. The idea was that they burst into a Bronze Age world wielding superior iron swords that could shatter the weapons of their foes. While romantic, this theory has been largely debunked. The Iron Age is so named not because iron caused the collapse, but because the collapse led to the widespread adoption of iron. With the intricate international trade routes for tin completely severed, it became impossible to make bronze. Iron, which is far more abundant, became the necessary cheaper substitute. The Sea People's advantage was not a miracle metal. It was a new way of fighting. In the end, their success was likely not due to any single technological marvel. It was a combination of new equipment slashing swords and round shields, and a new tactical approach, fast, fluid, and ferocious raiding, unleashed upon a world that was strategically and psychologically unprepared for it. The old empires built on the slow, deliberate power of massed chariots and rigid infantry blocks were like powerful but ponderous dinosaurs. The Sea Peoples were like packs of raptors, smaller, faster, more adaptable, and ruthlessly efficient at hitting vulnerable points. Their greatest weapon was their desperation, and they wielded it against civilizations that had forgotten how to be desperate. A fatal complacency that brought their world to a fiery end after the fires die down and the dust settles. History is normally written by the victors. They build monuments, commission epic poems, and carve their triumphs into stone for posterity. The Romans conquered the Mediterranean and left behind roads, aqueducts, laws, and a language that shaped the future of Europe. The Mongols, for all their ferocity, established vast empires and a new political order. But the Sea Peoples, they are the great exception. After bringing the world to its knees, after toppling empires and erasing cities from the map, they vanished, leaving behind an almost perfect deafening silence. Why? Why is there this ghost-shaped hole in the historical record? This is perhaps the most profound mystery of all. The simplest explanation is also the most likely: they were largely illiterate. The great Bronze Age civilizations had a professional class of scribes, an intellectual elite, who spent years learning the complex cuneiform or hieroglyphic scripts. Literacy was a specialized tool of the state confined to the palace and the temple. If the Sea Peoples were indeed a coalition of displaced peoples, decivilized refugees, and warriors there from the less developed fringes of Europe, it's highly probable that the vast majority of them could not read or write. They were a people of the sword and the sail, not the stylus. When they destroyed the palaces of Mycenaean and Hattusa, they weren't just burning buildings. They were burning the libraries, killing the scribes, and extinguishing the very infrastructure of literacy in those lands. You cannot leave a written record if your culture has no concept of writing, or if the few who could write are scattered and fighting for survival. Furthermore, there is a vast difference between raiding and ruling. The Sea Peoples proved to be masters of destruction, but they seem to have been utterly inept at construction. Their confederation was likely a fragile marriage of convenience, a temporary alliance held together by the momentum of their migration and the lure of plunder. Once they were decisively stopped by Egypt and their forward momentum was broken, the coalition likely fractured. The various tribes would have gone their separate ways, pursuing their own destinies. They failed to make that crucial transition from a mobile military force to a stable, centralized state. Without a state, there are no kings to commission monuments. Without a shared political identity, there is no history to write. They remained a collection of disparate warbands who, after the Great Storm was over, either faded away or assimilated into the local populations they now lived amongst. We see this process in the case of the Philistines. They were the great exception, the one group that did successfully establish a lasting political entity, their Pentapolis on the coast of Canaan. And yet even they left us no inscriptions of their own, no history of their origins, no epic of their journey from the Aegean. Why? It's likely they arrived as a small warrior elite, a non-literate aristocracy ruling over a much larger local Canaanite population. Over the course of a few generations, they would have adopted the local Semitic language and customs, and the memory of their ancestral homeland across the sea would have faded from a lived experience into a myth and oral tale that was never written down and was eventually lost. They assimilated so successfully that their own history was erased. So the silence of the sea peoples is not a single mystery, but a combination of factors. They were likely illiterate destroyers who failed to build a state of their own, and the remnants that did survive were eventually absorbed into the cultures of the new world they had helped create. They passed through history like a phantom, a force of nature that shapes the landscape but leaves no signature of its own. They were a catalyst, not a creator. Their legacy is not written in stone or on clay, but in the profound void they left behind. They did not just end a series of kingdoms. In many parts of the world, they brought history itself to a temporary halt, plunging the vibrant, literate, and interconnected world of the Bronze Age into a long and silent twilight. The silence of the sea peoples is echoed by the silence of the world they left behind. Their destructive passage marks one of the great dividing lines in human history. The moment the glittering, interconnected world of the late Bronze Age came to a sudden, violent end. What followed was a period of decline so profound that it is known as the First Great Dark Age, an era not necessarily of evil, but of obscurity. It's a period that is dark to us, the historians, because the lights of civilization, writing monumental art, international trade, were suddenly extinguished. Nowhere was this plunge into darkness more complete than in Greece. The collapse of the Mycenaean palaces was a total systemic failure. With the destruction of the central administrative hubs, the highly specialized skill of writing linear B vanished completely. There was no longer a state to pay. Scribes no inventories to keep. For the next 400 years, the people of Greece were illiterate. It was a great forgetting, a time when the epic tales of the Bronze Age heroes were kept alive only by the fragile thread of oral poetry passed down from one generation of bards to the next, until they were finally written down centuries later by Homer. The archaeological record tells a grim story of depopulation. It's estimated that the population of the Greek mainland may have plummeted by as much as 75%. Entire regions were abandoned. The survivors huddled together in small, impoverished, and isolated villages. The grand Cyclopean fortresses were left to crumble, their secrets and their treasures buried under layers of dirt. The sophisticated and beautiful Mycenaean pottery was replaced by crude, simple designs. The vibrant trade that had brought gold, ivory, and ideas from Egypt and the Near East ceased entirely. Greece turned inward, becoming a poorer, smaller, and more primitive version of its former self, a ghost haunting the ruins of its own magnificent past. This pattern, though most severe in Greece, was repeated across the fallen world. In Anatolia, the mighty Hittite Empire was gone, replaced by a chaotic patchwork of smaller feuding kingdoms. The great capital of Hattusa was a ruin. The Levant coast, once dotted with rich port cities like Ugarit, was a shadow of its former self. But in this destruction, there was also opportunity. The collapse of the great Egyptian and Hittite empires, which had dominated Canaan for centuries, created a power vacuum. It was in this chaotic new world, free from the boot of imperial control, that new peoples like the Phoenicians, the Arameans, and the Israelites were able to emerge, establish their own kingdoms, and write their own stories. And this new fractured world would be built with a new metal. The Bronze Age ended in part because the trade routes that brought tin from the east were severed forever. Without tin bronze, the alloy of empire could no longer be produced in large quantities. So, out of necessity, smiths turned to a more common, more accessible, but more difficult metal iron. The Iron Age was not born because a new superweapon was invented. It was born because the old world supply chain had collapsed. Iron was the metal of a post-apocalyptic world, a world forced to reboot itself with local materials and simpler technologies. The Sea Peoples therefore did more than just topple a few kings. They pulled the plug on an entire world system. They shattered the intricate connections that held the Bronze Age together, plunging much of the Mediterranean into a long dark period of isolation, poverty, and silence. It was a world broken into 1,000 pieces. And yet, one of the old giants had survived the onslaught. Egypt had met the storm head-on and had not broken. But victory comes at a price. And for Egypt, the cost of survival would prove to be almost as devastating as defeat. Amidst the wreckage of the Bronze Age, one great kingdom stood tall. Egypt, the eternal survivor, had faced the deluge and held it back. The reliefs at Medinet Habu are a testament to this triumph, a celebration of order preserved and chaos defeated. Ramesses III had saved his nation, and for this he was rightfully hailed as a hero, the last great warrior pharaoh of the new kingdom. But this victory, as glorious as it was, came at a staggering and ultimately fatal cost. It was a textbook Pyrrhic victory, a triumph so devastating that it was indistinguishable from defeat in the long run. The war against the Sea Peoples would have bled Egypt dry. Imagine the sheer economic cost of mobilizing the entire military machine of the state, of fighting a massive land battle in Syria, and a desperate naval war in the Nile Delta. All of this at a time when the traditional sources of Egypt's wealth were already crumbling. The trade and tribute that once flowed from its Asiatic empire had ceased as those lands had been destroyed or overrun. The gold from Nubia was likely harder to acquire as Egypt's grip on its southern neighbor weakened. The treasury was being emptied to fund a war for survival with no prospect of new imperial income to refill it. The human cost would have been equally immense. Tens of thousands of Egypt's farmers, craftsmen, and laborers would have been conscripted into the army, and even in victory, the losses must have been horrific. A generation of men was sacrificed to hold the line. This loss of manpower, combined with the economic strain, crippled Egypt's ability to function as a superpower. After the war, Egypt's imperial presence in Canaan and Syria evaporates. It retreats behind its borders, forced to abandon the empire its ancestors had fought for centuries to build and maintain. The victory was purely defensive. It saved the Egyptian homeland, but shattered its imperial ambition forever. The cracks began to show almost immediately, not on the frontiers, but in the very heartland of the kingdom. During the reign of Ramesses III, we have the first detailed account of a labor strike in history. The elite craftsmen who built the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, the most prestigious workers in the land, laid down their tools and protested because the state, its bureaucracy broken, and its granaries depleted by the war effort, had failed to deliver their monthly grain rations. If the pharaoh could not even pay the men building his own tomb, it was a clear sign that the economic and administrative power of the state was collapsing. The Ugarit reached the very top. Ramesses III's reign ended not in peaceful glory, but in a bloody palace coup known as the Harem Conspiracy, in which he was assassinated by rivals within his own court. This unleashed a long period of instability. A succession of weak pharaohs, all named Ramesses, presided over a steadily declining and fragmenting kingdom. The unity that had been Egypt's strength was broken, and the country eventually split into two, with separate rulers in the north and the south. Egypt was like a magnificent old tree that withstands the fury of a hurricane. It remains standing, a proud silhouette against the sky, but its roots are torn, its largest branches are shattered, and its core is fatally wounded. It can no longer grow. It can only begin the long, slow process of decay. The effort of repelling the Sea Peoples was the final glorious, exhaustive act of the new kingdom. It was a magnificent sunset, but a sunset nonetheless. In the centuries that followed, Egypt would be dominated by a succession of foreign powers: Libyans, Nubians, Assyrians, and Persians. It survived as a culture, but its time as a great independent power was over. The Sea Peoples had lost the battle, but in the end, they claimed one final victim. By forcing Egypt to muster all of its remaining strength for one last fight, they ensured that the great survivor would slowly bleed out, becoming a living monument to a glory that had passed away. What then is the final legacy of these historical phantoms? On the surface, their legacy is one of absence, of silence, of ruin. They were the tempest that swept through the ornate house of the Bronze Age, shattering its treasures, toppling its great pillars, and leaving it a hollow shell open to the sky. They were a force of almost pure destruction, an eraser of empires, and a burner of cities. And yet history has a strange and often brutal alchemy. Sometimes the most profound acts of creation are born from the most total acts of destruction. The Sea Peoples did not build a single city or found a single lasting kingdom of their own, but by destroying the old order, they inadvertently cleared the ground for a new one. Think of them as a great forest fire. The blaze is terrifying, consuming the ancient towering trees that have dominated the canopy for centuries. But after the fire passes, the ground is cleared, the soil is enriched with ash, and sunlight can finally reach the forest floor, allowing a riot of new species, new saplings to grow. The Sea Peoples were the great forest fire of the Bronze Age. Consider the power vacuum they created in the Levant. For centuries, this region had been a contested territory, dominated by the imperial ambitions of the Egyptians to the south and the Hittites to the north. The local Canaanite city-states were perpetually caught in the middle, forced to pay tribute and swear allegiance to one great power or the other. When the Sea Peoples shattered the Hittite Empire and mortally wounded Egypt, this imperial cage was broken. Suddenly, the local peoples were free. In this newly cleared space, the Phoenician cities of Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos rose to prominence. No longer constrained by the old powers, they became the new masters of the sea. Their ships replacing those of the fallen Mycenaeans, building a mercantile empire that would spread its colonies and its revolutionary alphabet across the entire Mediterranean. To their south in the highlands of Canaan, the collapse of Egyptian control allowed a collection of hill tribes to coalesce and forge a new national identity. Their struggle for survival and supremacy against one of the settled Sea Peoples groups, the Philistines, became a central defining narrative of their people, the ancient Israelites. The kingdoms of Israel and Judah, which would give the world monotheism, were born in the chaotic world that the Sea Peoples had made. The legacy of the Sea Peoples is therefore one of profound paradox. They are arguably one of the most influential forces in ancient history, yet they achieved this influence by building nothing. Their impact is measured not in what they left behind, but in the absences they created. The absence of Hittite legions in Syria, the absence of Mycenaean fleets in the Aegean, the absence of Egyptian governors in Canaan. It was this negative space, this vacuum, that allowed a whole new world to rush in. They were the bloody midwives at the birth of the Iron Age. They were the unintentional architects of a new geopolitical map. They were the ghosts whose destructive passage allowed new nations, new ideas, and new peoples to write their own stories on a cleared slate. Their legacy is a testament to the fact that history is not always made by kings and builders. Sometimes its course is irrevocably altered by the nameless, the dispossessed, and the desperate. They remind us that endings are always in some form beginnings, and that even from a world consumed by fire, new life can find a way to grow. And so our journey through the smoke and shadows of the past comes to an end. We began in a world that seemed eternal, a world of golden empires and great kings who called each other brother. We walked the mighty walls of Hattusa, sailed the wine-dark sea with Mycenaean heroes, and stood in awe before the immortal glory of the pharaohs. We felt the world grow brittle from drought and famine. We witnessed its fiery and sudden collapse, heard the last desperate cry for help from Ugarit, and finally, on a temple wall in Egypt, we saw the enemy given a name: the Sea Peoples. We have followed the clues, examined the evidence, and explored the theories, trying to unmask these phantoms of history. But after all this, the central mystery remains. There is no simple answer, no single culprit that can be definitively identified and convicted in the court of history. The case remains open. Were they a specific warrior people from the Aegean? The ancestors of the biblical Philistines, whose pottery is their telltale fingerprint? Were they a chaotic human tidal wave, a domino effect of displacement that washed across the civilized world? Were they the tragic survivors of their own fallen civilizations? Victims turned into predators? The ghosts of the Bronze Age come back to haunt their successors. Or were they simply the final violent spasm of a world system that was already dying? A world collapsing under the perfect storm of climate change, famine, rebellion, and earthquake? Each theory has its merits, and the truth may very well be a complex tapestry woven from the threads of all of them. And now I turn the question to you. Having heard the evidence, which theory seems most plausible to you? What piece of the puzzle, the feathered helmets, the desperate letters, the burn layers in the earth, do you find most compelling? I encourage you to share your thoughts in the comments below to continue the investigation that has fascinated historians for generations. Ultimately, the story of the Sea Peoples is more than just an ancient, unsolved mystery. It is a profound and unsettling lesson about the very nature of civilization. It reminds us that order is fragile, that complexity is a vulnerability, and that even the most powerful societies can unravel with breathtaking speed. In our own highly interconnected, globalized world, facing its own challenges of climate change, economic instability, and the movements of peoples, the tale of the late Bronze Age collapse feels eerily relevant. It is a ghost story, but one that holds up a dark mirror to our own time, reminding us that the intricate systems that support our lives are perhaps more delicate than we imagine. The Sea Peoples are history's great phantoms. Their legacy is paradoxical. They created a new world not by what they built, but by what they destroyed. They vanished into silence, but their actions shaped the course of Western civilization. They left no history of their own, forcing us to piece together their story from the records of their victims and the scars they left on the earth. And perhaps that is their ultimate legacy. They remind us that history is not just a collection of known facts, but a vast ocean of unanswered questions, and that sometimes the silences can speak more loudly than the words. They are gone, but their question still echoes down to us through the millennia when the foundations of the world begin to shake. Who will we become? Thank you for joining me on this journey into one of history's deepest mysteries. If you found this exploration thought-provoking, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more deep dives into the enigmatic corners of our past. I look forward to reading your theories and thoughts in the discussion below. Until next time, keep questioning.